June 21st, 1582. Honnoji Temple, Kyoto. The air, thick and humid with the Japanese summer, is a suffocating cocktail of smells. The sweet, calming scent of sandalwood incense, burning for hours in the temple's main hall, is suddenly pierced by something acrid and sharp. The smell of thousands of torches and the metallic tang of drawn steel. The gentle pre-dawn quiet is shattered not by the call of a temple bell, but by a sound that does not belong here in the heart of the imperial city: the splintering of wooden gates, the percussive roar of arquebus fire, and a rising, inhuman hum of thousands of voices shouting a single, chilling war cry. Inside, a man awakens from his sleep, not to the gentle rustling of paper screens, but to the cacophony of his own death. This man is Oda Nobunaga, the master of nearly all of Japan, and the world he has so brutally and brilliantly forged is now collapsing around him in a vortex of flame and betrayal. The shouts from outside are not from a foreign enemy, not from the armies of the Takeda or the Mori he had so recently scattered. The banners his few bodyguards can make out in the flickering torchlight. A sickening realization that dawns with the slowness of a nightmare bear the crest of the bellflower, the Mon of Akechi Mitsuhide, his most trusted, most capable, and most methodical general. For Nobunaga, a man who lived by the sword, who had personally cut down his own family members and burned thousands alive to achieve his vision, this was the one form of death he never anticipated. It was not a battle. It was an execution. It was not defeat. It was a negation of his entire existence, carried out by a man he had elevated, a man who knew his every move. The heat becomes unbearable, the ancient timbers of the temple groaning and then screaming as they are consumed. The smoke is a physical entity, a black, choking demon that fills the lungs, blinds the eyes, and erases the world. This is the end of the unifier, not on a glorious field of battle, but trapped in a burning wooden cage, cornered like an animal by his own creation. This was the final, horrifying sensory assault in a life defined by them. This is the narrative of him, the man they would call the Demon King, the great destroyer, the visionary who almost single-handedly dragged Japan out of the medieval darkness and into the modern age. This was the saga of Oda Nobunaga. His life was a testament to the idea that to create a new world, the old one must be utterly and mercilessly annihilated. He was a paradox given flesh, a minor provincial lord who rose to command the most powerful military machine Japan had ever seen, a patron of the arts and a butcher of priests, a student of European technology, and a man who contemplated his own divinity. Yet, the central, agonizing question of his story, the question that has echoed through the centuries, is not about his meteoric rise, but his catastrophic fall. How? How could a man of such profound intelligence, of such meticulous planning and calculated ruthlessness, who controlled 30 of Japan's 66 provinces and stood on the very precipice of total unification, be brought down in a single night of fire and blood? How did he fall not to the grand coalition of his enemies, who had tried and failed for decades to stop him, but at the hands of his own general, in the heart of his own territory, with almost no one to defend him? This was not merely a political assassination or a military coup. It was a deep, personal, and Shakespearean tragedy. To understand how the architect of a new Japan was consumed by the flames of his own creation, we must return to the world that spawned him, a world that was itself a raging inferno of ambition, chaos, and decay, a world crying out for a demon to impose order. The answer lies not in a single act of betrayal, but in the very character of the man himself, in the methods he used to climb, the enemies he made along the way, and the fatal flaw of a genius who could foresee every external threat, but remained blind to the darkness he was nurturing within his own inner circle. To understand this man, we must first return to the world of the mid-16th century, a Japan that was less a country and more a geographical expression, a shattered mosaic of feuding territories. This was the height of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, a period of more than 100 years of continuous, savage civil war. The central authority of the Ashikaga shogunate, once the military heart of the nation, had withered into a pathetic ceremonial husk in Kyoto, its shogun a powerless puppet manipulated by whichever local warlord was strong enough to occupy the capital. The true power lay with the daimyo, the regional lords who ruled their domains as absolute monarchs, their legitimacy measured not by imperial decree, but by the sharpness of their swords and the loyalty of their samurai retainers. It was a world of gekkokujo, where the low overthrew the high, where vassals betrayed their masters and sons rose up against their fathers. It was a Darwinian nightmare where alliances were as fleeting as morning mist, and the only constant was the specter of violent death. While in Europe, the great powers of England and France were bleeding each other dry in the final phases of the 100 Years' War, and the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent was casting its long shadow over the Mediterranean, Japan was locked in its own internal struggle, a self-contained crucible of violence. Into this brutal landscape, a new and disruptive element was arriving. From the south came the Nanban, the southern barbarians, Portuguese traders and Jesuit missionaries, sailing in their great black ships. They brought with them two things that would forever alter the destiny of Japan: a strange new faith, Christianity, and a terrifying new weapon, the arquebus, a matchlock rifle that could kill a mounted samurai in full armor from a distance, making a mockery of centuries of martial tradition. This was the chessboard of blood and ambition, upon which Oda Nobunaga would make his first moves, a world where only the most ruthless, the most adaptable, and the most visionary could hope not just to survive, but to conquer. Into this cauldron of chaos was born Oda Nobunaga in the year 1534, in the modest domain of Owari, a province not known for its power or prestige but for its strategic position and its constant internal strife. He was the son of Oda Nobuhide, a minor but ambitious warlord who had carved out a respectable territory through sheer force of will. But Nobunaga was not a son who brought his father pride. From a young age, his behavior was a source of constant scandal and embarrassment. He ran wild with commoners, dressed in bizarre, mismatched clothing, and showed open contempt for the rigid ceremonies and codes of conduct that defined the samurai class. He was given the derogatory nickname, the Fool of Owari, and most of his father's retainers saw him as a dangerously unstable and unworthy heir, a liability who would surely lead the clan to ruin. This public persona, however, was a meticulously crafted mask, a form of camouflage that allowed him to observe the world without being seen as a threat. Beneath the guise of the fool was a mind of chilling clarity and a profound understanding of human nature's darkest corners. His youth was not one of idle eccentricity. It was an apprenticeship in the brutal realities of power. He saw firsthand how his father had to constantly fight, scheme, and betray just to hold on to his small piece of land. He learned that tradition was a cage, honor was a luxury, and sentiment was a fatal weakness. When his father died unexpectedly in 1551, the Oda clan erupted into a bloody civil war, with multiple factions, including his own brother, Nobuyuki, vying for control. This was the moment the fool took off his mask, and the realm had its first terrifying glimpse of the man he truly was. He was not a fool. He was a predator who had been patiently waiting for the moment to strike. The first step into the great game for Nobunaga was not a grand campaign against a rival daimyo, but a cold and methodical consolidation of his own fractured home. The struggle for Owari province was a microcosm of the brutal pragmatism that would define his entire career. Immediately following his father's death, his authority was challenged from all sides. Powerful Oda retainers, who had long disdained him for his eccentric behavior, threw their support behind his more conventional and respectable younger brother, Nobuyuki. It was a classic Sengoku-era succession crisis, the kind that had torn countless clans apart and erased them from history. But Nobunaga did not act with the righteous fury of a wronged heir. He acted with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon. His first move was to feign weakness and reconciliation. He even forgave his brother's initial rebellion after their mother intervened, a move that his enemies mistook for foolish sentimentality. In reality, it was a calculated play to lull them into a false sense of security. He spent the next few years meticulously identifying the key players in the opposition, isolating them, and then destroying them one by one. The climax of this internal struggle came in 1557. Having been warned of a second plot by Nobuyuki, Nobunaga feigned illness, luring his brother into a private meeting at Kiyosu Castle. There, in the cold, unforgiving reality of a supposedly safe chamber, Nobunaga's loyal retainers ambushed and assassinated his brother. There was no trial, no ceremony, no pretense of justice. It was a raw and naked act of political survival. With this single, ruthless act, he sent an unmistakable message to everyone in his domain and beyond. There was no line he would not cross, and blood ties were no shield against his ambition. This was the foundation of his power, built not on tradition or honor, but on a terrifying and predictable calculus of absolute consequence. This brutal consolidation of his home province revealed the driving force behind the man, his secret motivation that was far more radical than mere territorial expansion. It was encapsulated in the motto he would later adopt and stamp on his personal seal, Tenka Fubu. While often translated as unify the realm under one sword, its true meaning was far more revolutionary. It was a declaration of war against the entire existing order. Nobunaga's inner demon was a profound and burning contempt for the world he had been born into. He looked at the once revered Ashikaga shoguns and saw only decadent, powerless puppets. He looked at the great Buddhist monastic complexes, like the warrior monks of Mount Hiei and the fanatical Iko-Iki, and saw not centers of faith, but vast, arrogant, and corrupt feudal powers who fielded their own armies, meddled in politics, and choked the life out of the peasantry. He looked at the ancient, noble families with their pedigrees stretching back centuries and saw only incompetent aristocrats clinging to outdated traditions while the country burned around them. His ambition was not simply to become the next shogun, to win the game as it was played. His ambition was to smash the game board to pieces and create an entirely new one in his own image. This was a vision of a Japan where power was based on merit, not birth, where the economy was unshackled from the control of temples and guilds, where a centralized, secular authority would impose order on the chaos. This was a terrifyingly modern and secular vision in a deeply feudal and spiritual age. This is what made him so dangerous and so alien to his contemporaries. They were fighting for land and honor, Nobunaga was fighting to murder a god, to kill the old Japan and birth a new one from its corpse, with himself as its absolute, unquestioned father. To achieve such a monumental and audacious goal, Nobunaga understood he could not act alone. His vision required not just followers, but allies who were as pragmatic and forward-thinking as he was. His most fateful and enduring encounter came in the immediate aftermath of his most spectacular early victory. In 1560, at the Battle of Okahazama, Nobunaga's tiny force of around 2,000 soldiers had ambushed and annihilated the 25,000-strong army of the powerful daimyo Imagawa Yoshimoto. It was a victory so improbable it seemed like an act of divine intervention. Among the vassals of the defeated Imagawa clan was a young, patient, and intensely shrewd daimyo named Matsudaira Motoyasu. For years, his clan had been a pawn, forced into servitude by the larger and more powerful Imagawa. With Yoshimoto's death, he was suddenly free. While lesser men might have sought revenge or fled into obscurity, this young lord saw an opportunity. He saw in Nobunaga not a reckless gambler, but a man who was fundamentally changing the rules of warfare and power. He chose to ally himself with the rising force from Owari. This man would soon change his name to Tokugawa Ieyasu. The alliance they forged was not based on friendship or sentiment, but on cold, mutual self-interest, and it would become the central axis upon which the unification of Japan would turn for the next 2 decades. Nobunaga was the hammer, brash, innovative, and destructive, smashing everything in his path. Ieyasu was the anvil, patient, resilient, and cunning, absorbing blows and consolidating gains. Nobunaga's visionary genius was now paired with Ieyasu's methodical persistence. This alliance secured Nobunaga's eastern flank, allowing him to turn his full attention west, towards the ultimate prize, the imperial capital of Kyoto. The meeting of these two men was a pivotal moment in Japanese history. It was the convergence of two complementary forms of genius, a partnership that would first conquer and then reshape the nation. The price of power, Nobunaga quickly demonstrated, was to be paid in audacity and blood, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the career-defining victory at the Battle of Okahazama in June of 1560. This was the moment that the Fool of Owari announced himself on the national stage as a terrifying new kind of leader. The situation was, by all conventional military logic, hopeless. The powerful daimyo Imagawa Yoshimoto, ruler of 3 provinces, was marching on Kyoto with a massive, confident army of some 25,000 men to install himself as the de facto ruler of Japan. His path led directly through Nobunaga's small domain of Owari. Nobunaga could field, at best, 3,000 men. His advisors were unanimous in their counsel: surrender, hide behind their castle walls, and hope for a negotiated settlement. To face Yoshimoto in open battle would be suicide, but Nobunaga's genius was his ability to see opportunity in desperation. He received intelligence that Yoshimoto, arrogant in his overwhelming superiority, had made camp in a narrow, wooded gorge to celebrate his initial victories. What followed was not a battle, but a masterpiece of psychological warfare and calculated risk. On the morning of the battle, Nobunaga famously performed and sang a verse from his favorite No play, Atsumori, a song about the ephemerality of life. Man's life of 50 years is but a dream, a vision. It was a gesture of a man embracing his own potential death, a performance that galvanized his small, terrified force. He then led his men on a rapid, circuitous march. As a sudden, violent thunderstorm erupted, providing the perfect cover of noise and blinding rain, Nobunaga threw his entire force into a ferocious, headlong charge directly at the heart of the Imagawa camp. The chaos was absolute. The Imagawa samurai, many of them drunk and their armor removed in the summer heat, were caught completely by surprise, believing the noise to be the thunder. In the mud and confusion, Nobunaga's elite troops located Yoshimoto's command post and, in a vicious melee, took his head. The death of the commander instantly shattered the morale of the entire Imagawa army, which dissolved into a panicked mob. A force of 25,000 was defeated by less than 3,000. Okehazama was more than a victory. It was a revolution. It proved that superior numbers, tradition, and prestige meant nothing in the face of surprise, speed, and a leader willing to gamble everything on a single, decisive moment. Following his stunning victory at Okehazama, Nobunaga's path to power was not an unimpeded march. His radical methods and soaring ambition quickly galvanized a powerful and diverse coalition of enemies who came to see him not as a unifier, but as an existential threat to their very way of life. This loose but formidable alliance, often referred to by historians as the Nobunaga Siegerline or anti-Nobunaga network, represented the collective forces of the old Japan rising up to crush the iconoclast from Owari. At its core were several of the most powerful and respected daimyo in the country. The Takeda clan, led by the legendary Takeda Shingen, boasted the most feared cavalry army in all of Japan, a force that had dominated the battlefields of the East for a generation. The Azai and Asakura clans to the north were powerful, long-standing houses with deep roots and extensive alliances. But the threat was not merely feudal. Nobunaga's most intractable and bitter enemies were the great Buddhist monastic institutions. These were not peaceful enclaves of scholarly monks. For centuries, complexes like the Enryaku-ji Temple on Mount Hiei and the decentralized, fanatical Pure Land Buddhist movement, known as the Iko-Iki, had amassed immense wealth, vast tracts of land, and formidable armies of warrior monks, Sohei. They were a state within a state, jealously guarding their privileges and tax exemptions, and they recognized in Nobunaga's secularizing ambition a threat to their 1,000-year dominance. The Iko-Iki, in particular, were a nightmare opponent. They were a popular movement, drawing followers from the peasantry and lower samurai classes, and they fought with a religious fervor that made them almost impossible to break, launching rebellions and sieges from their heavily fortified cathedral fortresses, like Ishiyama Honganji. This coalition of traditional samurai lords and powerful religious institutions represented everything Nobunaga sought to destroy, and they, in turn, saw him as a Dairokuten no Mao, the demon king of the sixth heaven from Buddhist cosmology, a literal agent of evil sent to destroy the Dharma. Their combined opposition would test Nobunaga to his absolute limits and push him towards acts of brutality that would forever cement his demonic reputation. Every great leader faces a moment of near catastrophe, a crucible that forges their resolve or breaks them completely. For Oda Nobunaga, this moment came in 1570 during the siege of Kanagasaki, and it was defined by a devastating betrayal that nearly cost him his life and his entire army. Having secured Kyoto, Nobunaga turned his attention north to punish the Asakura clan for defying his authority. His campaign was proceeding smoothly, his army driving deep into Asakura territory. He was confident, perhaps overconfident, because his rear was protected by his trusted ally and brother-in-law, Azai Nagamasa. Nobunaga had sealed this alliance by marrying his own sister, Oichi, to Nagamasa, a bond that in the world of the samurai was supposed to be sacrosanct. But the Azai had been allied with the Asakura for generations, and Nagamasa was caught between his new obligations to Nobunaga and his deep-seated loyalty to his old friends. He made a fateful choice. In a stunning act of treachery, Azai Nagamasa turned his army around and prepared to attack Nobunaga's forces from the rear, trapping them in a pincer movement between his own army and the Asakura to the front. Annihilation seemed certain. The news of the betrayal sent shockwaves of panic through the Oda army. It was at this desperate moment that Nobunaga's true character shone through the chaos. While his army was on the verge of collapse, he remained icily calm. He orchestrated a brilliant and harrowing rearguard action, led by two of his most capable future generals, Kinoshita Tokichiro, the man who would become Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. While they held off the enemy in a suicidal defense, Nobunaga led the main body of his force on a frantic, non-stop retreat back to the safety of Kyoto. He escaped with his life, but the psychological wound was deep. The betrayal by his own family member taught him a brutal lesson that would shape all of his future actions. In the world he sought to create, trust was an illusion and sentiment was a poison. From this moment forward, a new, colder, and infinitely more merciless Nobunaga emerged. He now understood that anyone who stood in his way, whether stranger, ally, or family, was simply an obstacle to be removed, without hesitation and without pity. Having survived the crucible of betrayal at Kanagasaki, Nobunaga's strategy evolved. He realized that raw military power was not enough. He needed the veneer of legitimacy to justify his conquest and undermine his enemies. His great opportunity from chaos came from the heart of the old system he despised, the city of Kyoto and the powerless Ashikaga shogunate. In 1568, a young claimant to the shogunate, Ashikaga Yoshiaki, fled to Nobunaga for protection and military support, asking him to march on the capital and install him as the rightful shogun. For Nobunaga, this was a gift from the heavens. He was not interested in Yoshiaki's personal ambitions, but he immediately grasped the immense symbolic power of the request. To march on Kyoto not as a conqueror, but as the champion of the legitimate shogun, would grant him a powerful justification for his actions. It would allow him to cast his enemies not as honorable daimyo defending their lands, but as rebels defying the will of the shogun, and by extension, the emperor. With breathtaking speed, Nobunaga assembled his army and swept towards the capital, scattering the token resistance in his path. He entered Kyoto not as a warlord, but as a kingmaker. He duly installed Yoshiaki as the 15th Ashikaga shogun, performing all the necessary ceremonies and paying lip service to the old traditions. But from the very beginning, it was clear who held the real power. Yoshiaki was a puppet on a string, his every move dictated by Nobunaga. This act was a masterstroke of political theater. Nobunaga was using the decaying institutions of the past as a tool for their own destruction. From his new position as the guardian of the shogun in Kyoto, he could issue requests and orders in the shogun's name, forcing other daimyo to either submit to his authority or brand themselves as traitors. It was the ultimate irony. The great revolutionary had seized control of the very heart of the establishment, and from within its hallowed halls, he would begin the systematic process of dismantling it, piece by piece. The ultimate expression of Nobunaga's revolutionary military genius, and the moment that arguably sealed the fate of the old samurai way of war, came at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. This was his greatest triumph, a battle that was less a contest of bravery and more a cold, systematic slaughterhouse. His primary antagonist at this point was the formidable Takeda clan, now led by Takeda Katsuyori, son of the great Shingen. The Takeda army, and particularly its cavalry, was the most feared fighting force in Japan, a seemingly invincible machine that had dominated every battlefield it had set foot on. When Katsuyori laid siege to Nagashino Castle, a key fortress held by Nobunaga's ally Tokugawa Ieyasu, a decisive confrontation became inevitable. Nobunaga marched to relieve the castle with a combined Oda-Tokugawa army of 38,000 men. But he did not plan to meet the legendary Takeda cavalry in a traditional head-on clash. Instead, he chose a battlefield and prepared it with meticulous and revolutionary care. He positioned his troops on a plain with a river at their back, and across their front, he ordered the construction of extensive layered wooden palisades, crisscrossing fences designed to break up and slow down a cavalry charge. Behind these fortifications, he placed a corps of 3,000 of his best ashigaru, or common foot soldiers, armed not with spears or swords, but with arquebuses. This was the key to his entire strategy. He organized his gunners into rotating ranks. As the first rank fired their slow-to-reload matchlocks, they would cycle to the back to reload, while the next rank stepped forward to fire. This created, for the first time in Japanese history, a continuous, rolling volley of gunfire. When the overconfident Takeda Katsuyori ordered his cavalry to charge, they were met not with a single volley, but with a ceaseless storm of lead. The result was a massacre. The heroic charging samurai were torn from their saddles by the impersonal bullets of low-born peasants. The pride of the Takeda was annihilated, their cavalry shattered against the combination of modern technology and brilliant tactics. Nagashino was more than a victory. It was a paradigm shift. It was the brutal, bloody announcement that the age of the individual samurai hero was over, and the age of massed, disciplined, technologically superior armies had begun. It was a victory for Nobunaga's new Japan, one with the tools and methods of a world his enemies could not even comprehend. At the zenith of his power, following the shattering victory at Nagashino, the psychology of Oda Nobunaga underwent a profound transformation. The fool of Owari was now the undisputed master of central Japan, and his sense of self began to escalate from mere ambition to something approaching a belief in his own divinity. This moment of hubris was perfectly and monumentally embodied in the castle he began constructing in 1576 on the shores of Lake Biwa, Azuchi Castle. This was not merely a military fortification, it was a statement, a theological and political manifesto built of wood and stone. Azuchi was unlike any castle ever seen in Japan. It was vast, opulent, and designed not just to defend, but to awe and overwhelm. Its most remarkable feature was its 7-story tenshu, or main keep. The upper floors were lavishly decorated by the greatest artists of the age, with rooms covered in gold leaf and painted with Chinese sages, dragons, and celestial beings. The very top floor was a gilded octagonal room, designed to represent the heavens. By building his residence at the summit, literally above the world, Nobunaga was making a clear and audacious statement. He was the center of the cosmos, the terrestrial equivalent of the pole star around which all else revolved. He invited Jesuit missionaries to tour the castle, not just to show off his power, but because he saw in their monotheistic faith a reflection of the centralized, absolute power he sought to impose. He even went so far as to allow, and perhaps encourage, his subjects to venerate him as a living deity, a god of a new, secular religion of order. At this moment of triumph, he saw himself not merely as a shogun or a ruler, but as a force of destiny, an agent of historical necessity, whose will was absolute because it was correct. This soaring hubris, however, contained the seeds of his destruction. A man who believes himself to be a god ceases to pay attention to the thoughts of mortals. He began to treat his own highly accomplished and proud vassals not as partners in his ascent, but as mere tools, instruments of his will to be used, abused, and discarded as he saw fit. This divine arrogance would prove to be his most fatal blind spot. Among the many brilliant and capable men who served Nobunaga, none was more complex, more accomplished, or ultimately more dangerous than Akechi Mitsuhide. He was, in many ways, the perfect foil to his master, a sworn enemy in the making, hidden in plain sight. Where Nobunaga was a disruptive, convention-shattering iconoclast from a minor provincial family, Mitsuhide was the epitome of the refined samurai ideal. He was a man of impeccable pedigree, a noted poet and scholar, a master of courtly etiquette, and a deeply respected traditionalist. He was also an exceptionally gifted general and administrator, and Nobunaga, recognizing his immense talent, elevated him rapidly, granting him vast domains and placing him in positions of incredible trust. For years, their relationship was one of symbiotic success. Mitsuhide's administrative skills brought order to newly conquered territories, and his diplomatic finesse smoothed over relations with the imperial court, lending an air of traditional legitimacy to Nobunaga's revolutionary project. However, a deep and corrosive friction grew between the two men. The chemistry of their relationship was one of growing resentment masked by duty. Nobunaga, in his characteristic fashion, seemed to take a perverse pleasure in publicly humiliating the refined and dignified Mitsuhide. The chronicles and tales are filled with anecdotes, some perhaps apocryphal, but all pointing to a pattern of abuse. There is the story of Nobunaga calling Mitsuhide kumquat head in front of other daimyo, a mocking reference to his short stature. The most famous incident occurred during a banquet in honor of Tokugawa Ieyasu, where Nobunaga, displeased with the quality of the food Mitsuhide had arranged, allegedly grabbed his head and slammed it into a serving tray. For a man as proud and conscious of his public image as Mitsuhide, these were not minor insults. They were deep, spiritual wounds that festered over time. He was the embodiment of the old world of honor and propriety that Nobunaga was systematically destroying, and he was being forced to serve the very agent of that destruction, suffering constant, casual degradations along the way. Nobunaga saw a useful, if overly sensitive, subordinate. Mitsuhide saw a tyrannical master who was not only destroying Japan's heritage, but also systematically stripping him of his own dignity. While Nobunaga's name is synonymous with conquest and destruction, his vision for a unified Japan extended far beyond the battlefield. In the territories under his control, he initiated a series of radical economic and administrative reforms that were as revolutionary as his military tactics. His goal was to break the stagnant feudal economy and create a dynamic, unified commercial space. The cornerstone of this policy was known as Rakuichi Rakuza, which translates to free markets and open guilds. For centuries, commerce in Japan had been throttled by za, powerful trade guilds and associations, often with connections to temples or aristocrats, that held strict monopolies over the production and sale of goods in certain areas. Nobunaga systematically abolished these monopolies in the towns and cities under his control, declaring that anyone could trade freely without paying exorbitant fees to a guild. This policy stimulated commerce, encouraged competition, and allowed talented merchants and artisans to rise based on their own merits. To further facilitate this new, vibrant economy, he embarked on a massive program of infrastructure development. He began to abolish the countless toll booths and customs barriers that had been erected by local lords, which had made travel and the transport of goods slow and expensive. He ordered the construction and improvement of roads, making them wider and more direct to facilitate the rapid movement of both armies and commercial goods. He also initiated a process of currency standardization, beginning to mint coinage that would be accepted across his growing domain, replacing the chaotic mix of local currencies. These were not the actions of a mere warlord interested only in plunder. They were the calculated policies of a nation-builder. Nobunaga understood that true unification required not just a single sword, but a single market, a single currency, and a single interconnected network of roads. He was laying the economic foundations for a modern, centralized state, a Japan where prosperity would flow not from inherited titles, but from the free movement of people and goods. A crucial and often misunderstood aspect of Nobunaga's worldview was his sophisticated engagement with the arrival of Europeans. His relationship with the Jesuit missionaries who followed the Portuguese traders to Japan was a masterclass in political pragmatism and intellectual curiosity. In an era when many daimyo were suspicious or openly hostile to these southern barbarians, Nobunaga welcomed them. He granted the Jesuits protection, allowed them to preach in the capital, and even funded the construction of a church in Kyoto. This was not born of any genuine interest in converting to Christianity. For Nobunaga, the Jesuits were a powerful tool and a source of invaluable knowledge. Politically, their presence served as a potent counterweight to his most hated domestic enemies, the powerful and militant Buddhist monasteries. By patronizing a rival faith, he could challenge the spiritual and political authority of institutions like the Enryaku-ji Temple. He famously encouraged public debates between the Jesuits and Buddhist monks, taking a keen interest in theological arguments and using them to publicly question and undermine the established Buddhist doctrines. Beyond the political utility, Nobunaga was genuinely fascinated by the knowledge and technology the Europeans brought with them. He was an early and enthusiastic adopter of the arquebus, the weapon that would win him the Battle of Nagashino. He was intensely curious about European military strategy, shipbuilding, geography, and astronomy. He famously wore Western-style armor and was often depicted with a globe, a symbol of a mind that was looking far beyond the traditional horizons of Japan. He saw the Jesuits not as holy men, but as conduits of information from a wider world, a world of power and ideas that he could adapt for his own purposes. His tolerance was not a sign of nascent multiculturalism. It was the calculated strategy of a supreme realist who understood that knowledge, like gunpowder, was a weapon, and he intended to monopolize every weapon he could find in his quest to forge a new Japan. Despite his string of incredible victories and his seemingly unstoppable momentum, the very methods Nobunaga used to build his power began to generate deep cracks in its foundation. His ambition was absolute, and he demanded absolute submission, treating any who resisted not as honorable opponents, but as obstacles to be eradicated with maximum prejudice. The most infamous and horrifying example of this policy was the siege of Mount Hiei in 1571. The Enryaku-ji temple complex on Mount Hiei was one of the most sacred and powerful centers of Buddhism in Japan, a sprawling city of monasteries that had stood for nearly 800 years. It was also a formidable military power that had openly sided with his enemies, the Azai and Asakura clans. When the monks refused his demands to surrender and align with him, Nobunaga decided to make an example of them that would terrorize all of Japan. He surrounded the entire mountain with his army of 30,000 men and gave a single, chilling order: kill everyone. His soldiers swarmed up the mountainside, setting fire to the ancient temples and libraries, systematically slaughtering not just the warrior monks, but all the priests, acolytes, men, women, and children who had sought refuge there. By various estimates, between 3,000 and 20,000 people were killed in a single day of methodical extermination. The fires on Mount Hiei burned for days, visible from the capital in Kyoto, a horrifying beacon of Nobunaga's new and terrible form of warfare. This act was a strategic masterstroke. It broke the back of the militant Buddhist resistance and sent a wave of fear through his remaining enemies. But it was also a profound moral catastrophe. It cemented his public image as the Demon King, a man devoid of respect for tradition, religion, or human life. Even among his own retainers, who were hardened to the endemic violence of the age, this level of calculated, sacrilegious brutality was deeply unsettling. The Demon King ruled through fear, but fear is a brittle foundation for an empire. It breeds a quiet, desperate hatred that waits for a single moment of weakness to erupt into vengeful violence. The final, fatal act in the drama between Nobunaga and his most brilliant general was not a grand strategic disagreement, but a series of intensely personal and public humiliations that, for a man of Akechi Mitsuhide's temperament, amounted to a spiritual death sentence. The psychology of Nobunaga's error was rooted in his soaring hubris. He had become so accustomed to absolute dominance that he forgot his subordinates were proud, ambitious men with their own sense of honor. The final straws came in quick succession in the year 1582. Nobunaga, preparing for a major invasion of the Chugoku region, ordered Mitsuhide to relinquish his current domains in exchange for new, unconquered lands in the territory they were about to invade. While on the surface a promotion, it was also a profound insult, stripping Mitsuhide of the lands he had painstakingly governed and forcing him to fight for his new reward. Shortly after, during a lavish banquet held at Azuchi Castle for his great ally Tokugawa Ieyasu, Nobunaga appointed Mitsuhide, one of his most senior generals, to the demeaning role of chief host and server. According to some accounts, Nobunaga became enraged over a minor detail and publicly berated and even struck Mitsuhide in front of the assembled daimyo, an unforgivable offense to a samurai's honor. For Nobunaga, this was simply how he operated. He used casual cruelty and dominance to keep his vassals in line, a tool to remind them of their place. He failed to understand that he was not dealing with a simple warrior. He was dealing with a proud, sensitive, and deeply respected aristocrat who had been pushed past his breaking point. For Mitsuhide, these acts were the culmination of years of slights. It was the final, irrefutable proof that in Nobunaga's new world, there was no room for his kind of honor, no place for his dignity. The decision to rebel was not just a calculated grab for power. It was an act of personal restoration, an almost ritualistic reclaiming of a self-worth that his master had systematically tried to destroy. Nobunaga's fatal error was in believing that a man's spirit could be broken without consequence. This fatal underestimation of the internal threat, born of supreme overconfidence, led directly to the greatest catastrophe of Nobunaga's life, the Honnoji incident. In late June of 1582, Nobunaga's grand project of unification was tantalizingly close to completion. He had dispatched his most powerful armies and his most brilliant generals to the far corners of Japan to crush the last pockets of resistance. His greatest general, Hashiba Hideyoshi, formerly Kinoshita Tokichiro, was deep in the west, laying siege to the Mori clan's Takamatsu castle. His most trusted ally, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was touring the Kansai region with only a small retinue, Another key general, Shibata Katsuye, was bogged down fighting the Uesugi clan in the north. The unifier himself, the central node of this vast military web, made a fateful decision. He decided to rest for a few days in Kyoto at the Honnoji Temple before heading west to join Hideyoshi's campaign. In the heart of his own territory, surrounded by loyal provinces, he felt perfectly secure. He brought with him only a small personal retinue of pages and bodyguards, numbering perhaps 100 in total. He had, in effect, left the king completely exposed in the center of the board. This was the moment Akechi Mitsuhide had been waiting for. On his own march west, supposedly to reinforce Hideyoshi, Mitsuhide suddenly changed course. He assembled his army of 13,000 men and gave them a new, shocking order. Pointing his war fan in the direction of Kyoto, he uttered the chillingly simple and now famous words, "The enemy is at Honnoji." His troops, loyal to him and long accustomed to the strange and often brutal orders of the Sengoku era, followed. Under the cover of darkness, they surrounded the temple, a steel net closing around a sleeping tiger. Nobunaga's strategic genius, his ability to see the entire map of Japan and move its pieces with unparalleled skill, had failed him in the most elementary way. He had conquered provinces and shattered armies, but he had forgotten the first rule of power. The most dangerous threat often comes not from the enemy at the gates, but from the trusted man standing right behind you. The news of the betrayal arrived as a confusing clamor in the pre-dawn gloom. The enemy is at Honnoji. For Nobunaga, awakened from his sleep, the first reaction was disbelief. He initially assumed it was a brawl among his own young pages, or perhaps a minor street disturbance. But as the sounds of battle intensified, the crack of arquebuses, the war cries, the clash of steel against the temple gates, the horrifying reality began to dawn. When a page returned, pale with terror, and reported seeing the bellflower crest of Akechi Mitsuhide on the banners of the attacking army, Nobunaga's disbelief turned to a cold, grim acceptance. He is reported to have said only, "It cannot be helped." In that moment, the grand strategist, the demon king, the man who held the destiny of a nation in his hands, was reduced to a cornered warlord with a handful of followers against an entire army. The collapse was swift and absolute. His small honor guard fought with desperate bravery, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The political and psychological collapse was instantaneous. The grand vision of Tenka Fubu, the unified Japan he had bled for, was now irrelevant. All that remained was the raw, primal reality of survival. The vast network of power he had constructed over decades, the armies crushing his enemies on distant fronts, were all useless to him now. His world had shrunk to the confines of a single besieged building. Trapped, betrayed by the man he had trusted with the defense of the capital itself, overwhelmed by thousands of his own well-trained soldiers, Nobunaga faced the final, ignominious checkmate. The unifier's last chance was not to escape, but to control the manner of his own exit from the stage he had so long dominated. In his final moments, Oda Nobunaga, the great destroyer, orchestrated his own disappearance from the world with the same defiant control that had characterized his entire life. The scene of the hero's finale was not one of despair, but of chilling, focused rage. As Akechi's soldiers breached the outer defenses and swarmed into the temple grounds, Nobunaga did not hide. He took up first a spear, then a bow, and fought alongside his last few retainers, the master of Japan reduced to a common soldier defending a barricade. He fought until an arrow struck him in the shoulder. Wounded, and knowing the end was inevitable, he made his final decision. The ultimate prize for any victor in a samurai conflict was the head of the enemy commander. It was a trophy, a proof of victory, a symbol of absolute dominance. Nobunaga was determined to deny Mitsuhide this prize. He retreated into the blazing inner chambers of the temple, which were by now a raging inferno. There, with his young page Mori Ranmaru in attendance, he committed seppuku, the ritual suicide of the samurai class he had so often scorned in life, but whose ultimate code he now embraced in death. As Nobunaga ended his own life, he gave Ranmaru one last order: to ensure the fire consumed his body completely, leaving nothing for his enemies. His final act was to turn his own corpse into a mystery, to erase his physical presence from the world, and transform himself into pure legend. The unifier, who had lived his life in the blazing fire of ambition, chose to die in a literal fire of his own making. The circumstances were profoundly ironic. A man who had built his power on the novel use of firearms was brought down by the classic samurai weapons of spear and arrow, and a man who had burned the sacred sanctuary of Mount Hiei to the ground met his own end in the ashes of another holy place. His death was a perfect, terrible circle, a final, defiant act of control that ensured his betrayal would be remembered, but his final defeat would never be seen. The legacy of Oda Nobunaga is a fierce and unresolved conflict of interpretations, a debate that rages in Japan to this day. He is a figure who defies simple categorization, seen simultaneously as a monster and a messiah, a demonic destroyer and a visionary nation-builder. For his detractors, and for the cultures and institutions he savaged, he remains the Demon King. They point to the massacre at Mount Hiei, the brutal suppression of the Iko-Iki, where tens of thousands were starved or burned alive, and his cold-blooded elimination of any rival, including his own family members. In this interpretation, he was a bloodthirsty tyrant, a man whose ambition was a cancer that devoured everything it touched, who trampled on religion, tradition, and human decency. His unification was not a noble project, but a brutal conquest that set a terrifying precedent for the use of absolute merciless power. However, an equally powerful interpretation sees Nobunaga as a great, if terrible, visionary. His supporters argued that the Japan of the 16th century was a failed state, a land locked in a century-long cycle of endemic violence from which it could not escape. The old systems, the shogunate, the Buddhist temples, the feudal codes of honor, were not just decaying, they were the very cause of the disease. In this view, Nobunaga was the harsh medicine the country desperately needed. His ruthlessness was not arbitrary cruelty, but a necessary surgical tool used to cut out the rot. He was the only man with the foresight to embrace new technologies, the courage to shatter outdated economic structures, and the sheer force of will to impose a centralized order on the chaos. Without Nobunaga's destructive groundwork, they argue, the final unification achieved by his successors, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, would have been impossible. He was the indispensable first stage of a three-stage rocket that launched Japan into a new era of peace and stability. Was he a demon or a visionary? The answer is that he was both. He was a man perfectly suited to his violent transitional age, a figure whose creative and destructive impulses were one and the same. So, we return to the central, haunting paradox. Why was the unifier betrayed? The final, comprehensive answer is that Oda Nobunaga was destroyed by the very logic that powered his ascent. His genius was to recognize that the traditional bonds holding feudal Japan together, loyalty to family, to one's daimyo, to the shogun, to the Buddhist dharma, had all failed. He systematically broke these old loyalties and demanded a new, modern, and absolute loyalty, not to a system or a faith, but directly and personally to himself. He created a world where merit and ruthless pragmatism were the only virtues that mattered. He taught his retainers to think like him, to be adaptable, to seize opportunities, and to see all relationships as transactional. And in Akechi Mitsuhide, he had his most brilliant student. Mitsuhide saw that his master was becoming increasingly arrogant and erratic. He saw his own honor, the last vestige of the old world he clung to, being systematically dismantled. And so he applied the central lesson of the Nobunaga school of realpolitik. If your lord becomes a liability, if he threatens your existence and offers you no path to advancement or security, then the most pragmatic and logical course of action is to remove him. The betrayal was not, therefore, an aberration from Nobunaga's New World Order. It was its ultimate expression. Nobunaga had burned down the forest of old traditions and loyalties, and in the cleared, barren landscape he created, the only rule was survival of the fittest. He had taught the wolf to hunt, and he was surprised when one day the wolf turned on him. He broke because he had succeeded too well in breaking everything else. He had created a system that was perfectly designed to empower a man like himself, but also perfectly designed to facilitate the betrayal of a man like Mitsuhide. The verdict of history on Oda Nobunaga is that his life serves as a timeless and brutal lesson on the nature of the revolutionary. He demonstrates the eternal paradox that to forge a new world, one must often employ methods so destructive that they threaten to consume the creator himself. He was a force of what the economist Joseph Schumpeter would later call creative destruction. He was a historical necessity, a human storm that had to happen to clear away the debris of a collapsed and rotting feudal structure. The old Japan of warring daimyo and militant monasteries could not have been coaxed into unity with diplomacy or appeals to tradition. It had to be hammered into shape, its discordant elements burned away until only a solid, malleable core remained. Nobunaga was that hammer, that fire. His flaw was not in his vision, but in his inability to transition from destroyer to builder, from warlord to statesman. His personality was perfectly suited for the chaos of the fight, but it was too abrasive, too cruel, too arrogant for the peace he was close to winning. He could not stop campaigning, could not stop humiliating his vassals, could not stop being the demon king, even when the demons had been largely vanquished. He united the country through the sheer force of his will, but he failed to unite the hearts of the men closest to him. His ultimate lesson is that you cannot build an empire on fear alone, for fear inevitably curdles into hatred, and hatred is simply a betrayal waiting for its opportunity. He paved the way for 250 years of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate, but the architect of that peace would not be him, but the man who patiently learned from his spectacular fall, the ever-cautious Tokugawa Ieyasu. The final frame, the image that lingers and encapsulates the entire saga, is not one of a triumphant warrior or a gleaming castle. It is the smoldering, empty ruin of Honnoji Temple in the gray dawn of a Kyoto morning. The smoke, thin and ghostly, curls up from the blackened timbers, carrying with it the ashes of a man and an era. His body was never found, swallowed by the flames, denying the world a final, concrete symbol. He simply vanished, leaving behind a power vacuum, a half-finished masterpiece, and a legend that is both terrifying and inspiring. The wind blows the ashes across the capital, a fine gray dust that settles on the rooftops of the city he had conquered, but never truly won. In that dust is the story of the man who held all of Japan in his grasp. a man who saw the future and tried to drag his nation into it by force, only to see it all turn to smoke and memory in a single fiery instant. The shadow of Oda Nobunaga would loom large over the men who followed him, a constant, silent reminder of the terrifying speed with which absolute power can be created, and the even more terrifying speed with which it can be undone. The empty space where he fell is the final testament to his life, a profound and violent absence that forced the birth of a new world.